I'm Margaret. I'm 62 years old, a retired school secretary, and a widow for the last 8 years. After my husband passed, my son insisted I move in with his family so I wouldn't be alone. He made it sound like a blessing, said it would bring us all closer, and I believed him. I gave up the house we built together, sold off most of my furniture, and packed my life into 2 suitcases and a rocking chair he always said reminded him of home. That was 3 years ago. I've lived in their guest suite since then, a room above the garage they call the in-law unit. It has a small kitchenette, no real windows, and a door that doesn't lock. I tried to hang up a picture once, a photo of my husband and me at the lake, and Lindsay, my daughter-in-law, asked me to take it down. Said it didn't match the rest of the decor. I didn't argue. I rarely do. It happened 4 days before Christmas. I was folding laundry, fresh from the dryer, in that little utility room off the main hallway. The door was cracked, and I could hear them in the kitchen. I wasn't trying to listen. I wish I hadn't. Jason's voice came first, low and tired. He said, almost too casually, that if she died, it would honestly be the best Christmas gift. Just like that. No anger, no hesitation. Just a flat, exhausted truth. My hand stopped moving. I stared at the red bath towel in my grip like it might catch fire. For a moment, I thought maybe I misheard. Maybe he said he was tired or overwhelmed. Maybe it wasn't about me at all. But then Lindsay answered. You said it, not me. She sounded amused, not surprised, not disturbed, just accepting. There was a silence after that, a kind of silence that makes your chest tighten because it confirms the worst. Jason didn't laugh. He didn't take it back. He just sighed and said, we can't keep doing this. It's exhausting having her here all the time. I don't know what hurt more, his words or the way Lindsay didn't even flinch. I stood still, afraid that even the sound of my breathing might betray me. My legs were trembling, but I didn't move. I couldn't. I pressed my hand against the dryer for balance and waited for the numbness to catch up with the shock. Then I walked out, quietly, slowly, like a ghost, trying not to disturb the living. Back in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, the same spot I always sit when the world feels too loud. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just reached into the drawer next to the bed and pulled out the old spiral notebook, where I write reminders to refill my prescriptions and jot down grocery needs. I flipped to a clean page and wrote the sentence, word for word. If she died, it would be the best Christmas gift. I stared at it for a long time, read it again, then again. Each time it felt sharper, colder. I thought about the baby I raised, the boy who made me macaroni necklaces in 2nd grade, who held my hand at his father's funeral. That same boy had become a man who now saw my death as a relief. And he'd said it so plainly, so easily, like it was a solution to a minor inconvenience. My chest ached, not in a dramatic, movie kind of way. It was deeper than that, a hollow ache, like something had been scooped out of me and tossed aside. I looked around my small beige room. The walls were blank. The dresser was old and chipped. The floor was clean, but joyless. This was supposed to be my safe place. Instead, it felt like a waiting room for the unwanted. And still, I didn't cry. I think that's what scared me the most. After that night, I started noticing things I'd ignored for far too long. Or maybe I'd noticed them before, but chose to excuse them. When you love someone, you shrink yourself without realizing it, hoping it helps them breathe easier. But in this house, the shrinking had become my entire identity. My room wasn't really mine. Lindsay picked the paint color. Neutral. No personal photos. No family keepsakes. I once tried putting up a small cross-stitch I made years ago. Jason asked me to take it down because it didn't match the style. They called it the guest suite, but I was no guest. Guests are offered comfort. I was more like a fixture present, functional, but always in the way. I had to ask before rearranging anything. The throw pillows on the couch, the pantry organization, and even which bathroom to use when we had company. Lindsay had rules. So many rules. And I followed them all, hoping it would make me less of a burden. I wasn't allowed to take the kids anywhere without texting first. If they wanted a sleepover in my room, I had to check if it fit with their schedule. When my oldest granddaughter asked if we could make cookies in my kitchen upstairs, Lindsay said it would make a mess. The girl apologized like she'd done something wrong. I told her it was fine. It wasn't. But I smiled anyway. It got to the point where I stopped sitting in the living room unless no one else was around. I felt like I was trespassing in the home I'd helped pay for. When they had guests over, I stayed upstairs. Not because they told me to, but because I could tell I wasn't part of their picture. It was easier to be absent than to be reminded I wasn't wanted. I became a background character in their life. I was there, but never centered. I cooked, cleaned, babysat, and paid for groceries when things were tight. But when it came to decisions, celebrations, and even dinner conversations, I was quiet. I felt erased. Not because they screamed at me or locked me out, but because slowly, over time, they made me invisible. And I let them. I didn't mean to check the account. I hadn't logged into that online banking page in over a year. But something about Jason's tone lately, the way he talked about bills and how tight things were, made my stomach twist. So I sat at my small desk upstairs, opened my laptop, and typed in the password I hadn't used since we first moved in together. The numbers didn't lie. I blinked at the balance, and then blinked again. The emergency fund I'd set up years ago, meant for medical costs or real crises, had been nearly drained. Line after line showed withdrawals. Grocery store charges, home improvement stores, a few cash transfers labeled family support that I never approved. I scrolled through, growing numb. It wasn't just the money. It was the silence around it. Jason never asked. He never even mentioned it. He just took what he needed, like it was his to take. I'd given him access years ago, told him it was for just in case. I didn't expect him to test the limits of my trust until there was nothing left. The deeper I looked, the clearer it became. Every time they smiled and said thank you for dinner, or joked about me being a lifesaver, they already knew I was footing the bill. Not because they were grateful, but because they assumed I would. That was the worst part. It wasn't the money. It was realizing I'd been turned into a safety net no one respected. I sat there for a long time, the screen glowing in the dim light, my heart pounding. The betrayal settled into my chest, heavier than I expected. I had always told myself they were just stressed. Young families struggled, that it was temporary, but now I saw it clearly. It wasn't just financial dependence, it was entitlement. I closed the laptop slowly, like it might explode. My hands didn't shake. My breath stayed steady. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel confused. I felt awake. And somewhere underneath the sadness, a quiet voice whispered something I hadn't let myself say out loud in years. Enough. Robert was always the practical one. Even when we were young and reckless, he carried a calm awareness of how quickly life could change. When he was diagnosed, he sat me down one evening after dinner, his hand over mine, and said something I didn't want to hear but never forgot. Don't trust anyone with your future, not even the people you love most. I argued with him. Told him Jason would never take advantage of me. He didn't press it. He just said, prepare anyway. So we opened a separate account. He had me sign copies of the co-ownership deed for the house, even though Jason promised to update everything later. He drafted a letter with our attorney, explaining my legal standing if anything went wrong. He called it Plan B, tucked it all into a manila envelope, and taped it beneath the bottom drawer of our nightstand. Back then, I thought it was unnecessary, maybe even paranoid. Jason was a good son. He had a big heart. But Robert had lived long enough to know that love doesn't always survive pressure, that sometimes desperation makes people forget who they are. I didn't agree with him then. I do now. After I read through the bank statements, I pulled that drawer open for the first time in years. The tape had yellowed at the edges, but the envelope was still there. His handwriting hadn't faded. I sat cross-legged on the floor, the envelope in my lap, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't felt in this house. Protected. I unfolded each page slowly, like a ritual. The bank account details, the notarized letters. The deed has both our names printed clearly across the top. Jason had never filed to remove me, never followed up with the lawyer. He said he would. He never did. Maybe he forgot. Or maybe he thought I wouldn't notice. But Robert didn't forget. Robert had planned for this moment. Not because he didn't trust our son, but because he trusted me to know when enough was enough. As I sat there surrounded by paperwork and memories, I felt him with me again. Not in a ghostly way, just in that quiet, steady way. He always showed up when I needed him most. The next morning I called Sophia, the lawyer Robert and I trusted for years. Her voice was warm and steady, and she remembered everything. I didn't need to explain much, just asked if the paperwork we'd signed was still valid. She didn't hesitate. Of course it, Island Jason never filed to remove you. Your name is still on the deed. You legally own 40%. I didn't cry. I didn't even smile. I just nodded, even though she couldn't see me, and said, "Thank you." When we hung up, I opened the window to let in some air. It was sharp and cold. I welcomed it. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't drowning. I was swimming to shore. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop again, but this time not for banking. I pulled up the airline rewards program I'd been quietly contributing to for years. One-way ticket. Out of state. No return date. The woman on the phone sounded cheerful as she confirmed my reservation. I picked a city I'd always dreamed of but never dared to visit. A place with no ties. Just space. Next, I opened a blank document and drafted a notice of intent to sell. Simple, professional, final. Sophia would revise it, make it airtight, and send it to both Jason and Lindsay's personal inboxes. I made sure of that. They wouldn't see it coming. That was the point. They thought I was background, but they forgot I was still on the title. As the printer hummed, I folded laundry like I always did. I emptied the dishwasher. I made dinner for the kids. I answered questions with the same quiet tone. No one noticed anything different, but inside, I felt the shift. Every plate I stacked, every drawer I closed, was one step closer to freedom. Before I went to bed, I sealed the printed notice in an envelope and slid it under Jason's office door. No signature, no explanation, just facts. Let the paper speak louder than all the words I never said. That night, I didn't toss and turn. I slept deeply, like my body knew something was finally in motion. Not revenge, not escape, just closure. And it had already begun. The power went out on Christmas Eve. No warning, no flicker, just silence, followed by the sudden darkness that swallowed the house whole. At first, I thought it was a neighborhood outage. But when I peeked out the window, the other houses were glowing warm with lights and soft music. Only ours sat in the dark. Voices started rising downstairs. Lindsay's first, sharp and frantic. She was yelling about the fridge, the dinner she'd prepped, and her mother flying in from out of state. Jason snapped back, blaming billing errors, saying he thought the bill had been paid. I stayed upstairs, seated in my chair by the window, listening like I always did. This time, though, I wasn't worried. They paced the kitchen, slammed drawers, flipped switches like it would change something. Lindsay called the electric company, demanding answers. Jason muttered under his breath about how embarrassing this would be if anyone found out. I could hear him opening cabinets, shuffling through papers, searching for something that wasn't there anymore. I didn't move, didn't speak. I didn't offer to help. I'd spent years patching holes in their lives before they even noticed the cracks. But tonight, the silence was my answer. The house was dark, but my mind was clear. Later, when their arguing softened into tired silence, I quietly pulled out the small brown packages I'd prepared earlier. One for each grandchild. Wrapped in plain paper. No ribbons. Inside each was a handwritten letter. Not a goodbye. Just memories. Reminders of the stories I'd told, the games we played, the afternoons we spent baking. I wanted them to know I loved them, no matter what happened next. I slipped downstairs, careful not to wake anyone. The tree still stood in the corner, but without lights. It looked like a shadow of what it had been. I placed each gift gently beneath it. My heart ached, but I didn't hesitate. This was my final offering, one last act of care they couldn't return or erase. Back upstairs, I finished packing, just one suitcase. I left the room as I found it. Neat, empty, silent. I glanced around one more time, not with regret, but with quiet release. This wasn't a home anymore. It was just a structure I no longer belonged to. At 4 a.m., I rolled my suitcase down the stairs, past the living room, past the cold kitchen, and toward the front door. No one heard me. No one stopped me. I opened the door to the soft crunch of fresh snow on the porch steps. The shuttle driver nodded, took my bag without a word. As we pulled away, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The lights were out. But I had finally stepped into my own. 2 days after I landed, I received a string of missed calls. First Jason, then Lindsay, then Jason again. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally understood I wasn't required to. They hadn't heard me for years. They didn't get to demand my voice now. Instead, I sat at a small wooden table in the apartment I was borrowing, opened a fresh sheet of paper, and began writing by hand. Not an email, not a text, a real letter. The kind that takes time, the kind that can't be deleted. I wrote his name at the top and let the truth come through without flinching. I told him I remembered every dollar, every grocery bag, every heating bill I paid quietly. I reminded him I sold my house for his down payment, moved into a room with no lock, gave up space, dignity, and privacy for the promise of family. I reminded him of the nights I babysat so they could go out, the mornings I drove the kids to school when they overslept, the thousands in quiet support that I never once asked to be repaid. Then I listed the things I never said out loud. How Lindsay rolled her eyes when I spoke. I was told to keep my decorations boxed up. How I needed permission to cook in the kitchen I helped fund. How I sat in silence, feeling small, as they made plans I was never part of. How I faded from their story, day by day, smile by smile, until even my existence became inconvenient. I wrote about the night I overheard him say it. Not in anger. In weariness. That my death would be a relief. I told him I never expected perfection. But I did expect respect. And that's when that died. Something inside me did too. And then I wrote the only line that truly mattered. This house was a gift. So was I. You lost both. I folded the letter carefully and mailed it with no return address. It wasn't meant to be a conversation. It was a conclusion. I didn't need him to understand it right away. I just needed him to know I meant every word. When the confirmation email came from Sophia that the legal notice had been served, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt settled. The silence that followed was mine to keep. I had drawn a line, not in anger, but in self-preservation. And once drawn, I would never step back over it again. The town I chose wasn't anything fancy, just a quiet stretch of coast with a coffee shop on every corner and streets that smelled like salt and fresh bread. The kind of place where no one knew my name, and that was exactly what I needed. No explanations, no performances. Just air that felt clean. And mine. Each morning, I walked to the same bench by the water, with a notebook and a cup of coffee. I'd watch the boats come in, and let the quiet settle around me. Sometimes, I wrote about the kids. Sometimes I didn't write at all. I wasn't trying to forget them. I just wasn't carrying them anymore. I thought there would be guilt. The kind that presses down on you at night. But there wasn't. What I felt instead was space. Wide, open space to breathe and be a person again, not a role. I didn't realize how much I disappeared inside that house until I stepped outside it for good. I missed their laughter. I missed the sound of my granddaughter's feet running down the hallway. But I didn't miss the silence that followed when I entered the room. I didn't miss having to ask to be heard. Love shouldn't cost you your voice. The apartment I rented was small, but it had light, big windows and creaky floors. I filled it with things I liked, not things that matched. A yellow chair, a chipped mug, a quilt my mother made. Every item had meaning. Every corner felt like mine. One afternoon, I passed a shop window and saw my reflection. I looked older than I remembered. Softer, too. Not weak, just released. My shoulders had dropped. My jaw wasn't clenched. I looked like a woman who had finally come home, even if the place was new. I started writing lists in my notebook. Not chores, not grocery needs, but things I would never do again. I will never beg to be respected. I will never stay where I am invisible. I will never call it love if it leaves me hollow. Each line was a promise, sealed in ink. They reached out again, weeks later. Messages. A voicemail about how hard things had become. I listened. I didn't respond. Their pain wasn't mine to fix anymore. I didn't need revenge. I didn't even need apologies. I just needed peace. And I found it. I didn't just walk away. I walked toward myself.